The wind swept across the empty plains of Dusty Creek, carrying with it the scent of hay, iron, and loneliness. For years, the ranch had been a quiet kingdom of silence, broken only by the soft whinny of horses and the deep sigh of a man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. That man was Caleb Rowen, a rancher with shoulders broad enough to carry grief and a heart quiet enough to hide it. He'd buried his wife 4 winters ago, left with a ranch to tend, and 2 small children who asked too many questions he couldn't answer. The nights had been the worst, when the firelight flickered against the walls and his daughter, Annie, whispered, "Papa, will Mama come back from heaven if we write her a letter?" He never answered. He just tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and stared out the window until the stars blurred. Then came the letter. It arrived in a worn envelope, creased and dusty, with handwriting too elegant for the prairie. It was from an agency in St. Louis, a mail-order bride registry. Caleb had never thought he'd be that kind of man. But the winters had grown colder, the work heavier, and the silence unbearable. The letter promised a woman of character, kindness and courage, a woman seeking a home, not fortune. Her name was Evelyn Grace Whitmore, a teacher from Virginia, whose life had turned to ashes. After a carriage accident left her unable to walk. Her family had abandoned her, the school dismissed her, and she'd written to the agency not for survival, but for purpose. Her letter had said, "If a man can see more than my chair, he will find in me a heart unbroken by pity." Those words struck something deep inside. Caleb, something he hadn't felt since his wife died. A strange pull, a flicker of warmth, maybe even hope. So, against the judgment of his neighbors and his own doubts, he sent back a single line in reply. "You'll have a home here. If you can bear the dust, I can bear the silence." And so she came. The train from the east arrived one sun-soaked afternoon, whistling like a promise breaking open the sky. The platform filled with faces, curious, whispering, waiting. Ranchers, storekeepers, widows, children, they'd all heard. The widower rancher had ordered himself a bride. But no one expected what stepped off that train. Evelyn appeared in a pale cream gown, her hair pinned in the modest curls of a lady, her eyes soft but strong. And then they saw it, the wheelchair. The polished oak wheels gleamed under the sun as she was carefully rolled down by a porter. A hush fell over the crowd. Some men looked away, others smirked. Caleb stood still, hat in hand, every heartbeat loud as thunder in his chest. He had prepared himself for anything, but not this. Evelyn's gaze found him through the crowd. For a moment, the noise of Dusty Creek vanished. He saw not weakness, not pity, but defiance. The kind that comes from a soul that refuses to break. She held a small envelope in her lap, the one he had written to her, and smiled faintly. "You must be Mr. Rowen," she said softly when he approached. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with strength too proud to hide. Caleb swallowed hard. "Ma'am," he managed, tipping his hat. "You come a long way." "I've nowhere else to go," she replied, eyes steady. Behind him, Annie tugged on his sleeve. "Papa, is she the lady who's going to help with the cooking?" Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile. "I can't do much standing, little one. But I make a fine apple pie if someone fetches the apples." That was the moment, quiet and unspoken, when something inside Caleb shifted. Weeks passed, and Dusty Creek began to whisper about them. Some called her the brave bride in the chair. Others mocked softly, behind her back. But Evelyn never bowed her head. She rolled across the ranch yard each morning, her skirt catching the breeze, and directed the ranch hands with a voice calm and certain. She couldn't stand on her feet, yet somehow, everyone started to stand straighter around her. Caleb watched from the porch most days, his hat low, his mind a storm. He'd thought she'd come for shelter or charity, but she came to live. She read stories to his children by lamplight, fixed their torn clothes, and filled the home with a grace he hadn't felt in years. When the winter wind howled through the ranch, her laughter turned the cold into something warmer than the fire. But deep down, Evelyn carried a secret. Every night when the house went quiet, she wrote letters she never sent. Letters to the woman she once was. The teacher who used to walk along rivers, who danced under lanterns, who believed her future was her own. She feared Caleb pitied her. She feared this life was a mercy, not love. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Caleb walked into the barn and found her alone. The wheelchair was beside the hay, and she sat on a stool trembling, her hands gripping the edge of a wooden beam. Sweat ran down her face. "Evelyn!" he shouted, rushing forward. "What on earth are you doing?" She looked up, eyes wet but burning. "I'm trying to stand." He froze. "I can feel my legs sometimes," she said through gritted teeth. "I can't stop wondering. What if I tried harder?" He knelt beside her, voice breaking. "You'll hurt yourself. You don't have to prove anything to me." Her eyes flashed. "I'm not doing it for you. Mr. Rowen, I'm doing it because I want to remember the woman I used to be." The barn fell silent except for her labored breaths. Caleb reached out instinctively, steadying her trembling hands. "You're stronger than you think," he whispered. "I don't feel strong," she said, voice cracking. He looked at her for a long moment. "That's what makes you brave." From that night on, something shifted between them, something deeper than words. They began to share the quiet moments, breakfast on the porch, stories after supper, the rhythm of a home rebuilt by two broken souls. Caleb taught her the names of the horses, and she taught him how to laugh again. Annie started calling her Mama Eve, and even little Thomas began to run to her before his father. And still Evelyn practiced, every night, every dawn, holding the edge of tables, pushing her legs with trembling will. She fell more times than she rose, but she never stopped. One morning, as the first light touched the ranch, Caleb came into the kitchen and found her gone. Panic gripped him until he saw the door open toward the barn. He ran and froze at the sight before him. Evelyn stood. Just barely. Her legs quivered, her hands held tight to a post, but she was standing. The sun spilled through the window, bathing her in gold. "Evelyn!" His voice cracked like a boy's. She turned slowly, eyes shining with tears. "I wanted to surprise you." He stepped closer, afraid that even his breath might break the moment. She laughed softly, wobbling a little, and he caught her in his arms. For the first time, their embrace wasn't of pity or duty. It was of two hearts finding their balance together. After that day, Evelyn began to walk again. First with help, then alone. Slow, uneven steps across the dirt yard, each one cheered by the children. The town that once pitied her now watched in awe. Months passed. Spring came to Dusty Creek, painting the hills in wildflowers. And one Sunday morning, Caleb took Evelyn into town. The church bell rang, echoing across the valley. The townsfolk gathered, whispering. She rolled up to the altar. The same woman who'd arrived months ago, fragile but proud. When the preacher asked, "Do you take this man?" she smiled and said, "I already have." And then, as the sun streamed through the windows, she rose from her chair, slowly, trembling, but standing, and everyone gasped. Caleb's eyes filled with tears as he stepped forward. "You shouldn't be standing." She smiled through her tears. "I can't imagine saying I do sitting down." The crowd fell silent, hearts pounding. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a resurrection. The woman who'd come to Dusty Creek broken had stood again. Not because she healed in body, but because she healed in love. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky burn orange, Caleb spoke quietly. "You changed this place, Evelyn. You changed me." She rested her head on his shoulder. "No," she whispered. "You gave me a reason to believe again." The wind moved through the wheat fields like a hymn. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now sang with laughter. Children's footsteps and the sound of life beginning again. Evelyn had shown up in a wheelchair for marriage and left, everyone speechless, not because she could walk, but because she had taught a man how to live again. And sometimes that's the real miracle. Not the legs that move, but the heart that finally does. The summer after the wedding was the kind that wrote itself into memory. Soft, golden mornings, children's laughter echoing through the valley, and the gentle rhythm of a ranch reborn. Evelyn walked more now. Her steps were still uncertain, but they carried the strength of a woman who had learned to fall and rise 100 times. The wheelchair stayed by the porch most days, touched only when fatigue came like an old friend. Caleb had changed too. The lines on his face had softened, the silence that once haunted him now replaced by a low hum as he worked the fields. Sometimes he'd glance toward the house and see Evelyn teaching Annie her letters by the window, and his heart would fill with something too big for words. Love, yes, but also peace. But peace on the prairie never lasted long. That year, Dusty Creek saw the fiercest storm in decades. The sky turned dark at noon, winds howled like wolves, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of thunder. Caleb had gone to the north pasture to drive the cattle back when the storm hit. Evelyn stood at the door, rain drenching her dress, praying he'd come home safe. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment she saw him, far in the distance, struggling with the herd. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and pushed her chair out into the storm. Annie screamed for her to stay inside, but Evelyn's voice rose above the wind. He came for me when the world turned its back. I'll go for him now. The rain lashed against her as she wheeled herself across the muddy yard, the wheels sinking deep, her arms shaking. Then, halfway across the field, the chair caught in the muck and refused to move. She pushed harder, but the storm was merciless. That's when she heard it. The desperate cry of a child. Annie had run after her, her small figure fighting against the wind, clutching a lantern that barely flickered. Evelyn's heart froze. "Annie, go back!" she screamed. But it was too late. The little girl slipped, the lantern shattered, and flames burst through the dry haystack nearby. Evelyn's instincts roared awake. With trembling arms, she pulled herself out of the wheelchair and crawled through the mud, dragging her body toward Annie. The rain mixed with tears, the fire's heat against the storm's cold, and for a moment the world became a blur of fear and love. She reached her daughter, covered her with her own body, and prayed for a miracle. Then a shadow fell over them. Caleb, soaked and bleeding from a cut across his forehead, appeared out of the storm. He scooped Annie into one arm and reached for Evelyn with the other. "You shouldn't have come out here," he shouted through the rain. She looked up at him, breathless. "I couldn't just sit and wait." He smiled through the chaos. "You never could." They made it back to the house as the storm broke apart. By dawn, the rain stopped and the sky cleared into gold again. The ranch was a wreck, fences torn, fields flooded, but they were alive. And in that morning light, Evelyn realized she hadn't felt the chair beneath her since. She'd left it behind in the storm. She stood, not carefully this time, but fully. Her legs shook, but they held. Caleb turned, saw her standing by the window, and dropped the bucket he'd been carrying. He began. She smiled softly. "I think the storm finished what love started." He walked to her, eyes wide with disbelief and joy. "Evelyn," she touched his face. "Don't you see? I wasn't waiting for healing. I was waiting for purpose." In that quiet moment, with the ranch still dripping from the night's fury, something sacred filled the air. The kind of peace that only comes after surviving the impossible. From that day forward, Evelyn never used the chair again. She didn't throw it away. She kept it by the porch, a reminder of who she had been and how far she had come. Visitors to the ranch would often ask, "Who did that belong to?" Caleb would smile and say, "To the strongest woman in Dusty Creek, and the storm that couldn't break her." Years later, when Annie grew up and had children of her own, she'd tell them stories of her mother, the woman who rode across a storm, who learned to stand not just on her legs, but on her faith. And when Evelyn sat under the old oak tree, watching her grandchildren play in the same fields where she once struggled to walk, she'd whisper to herself, "Some journeys don't end when you stand. They begin there." The wind would move through the grass like a hymn, carrying her words into the endless horizon. She had come to Dusty Creek in a wheelchair, searching for a home. She found a storm, and a love strong enough to make her rise again.